Once upon a time, I wore a winter hat in my living room. You clicked on a video, and we talked about great books to read this winter. Hey, welcome back to BellTube. I'm Brian Bell, and today I want to share with you 7 books that I think are going to be great reads for you this winter. They're kind of winter themed. They feel winterish to me. Some of them have appeared on other folks' lists. Some of them may not have. So I think you'll get a wide variety here, and hopefully you'll find something for you here. The first book that I want to talk to you about is by George R.R. Martin, and it's called The Winds of Winter. Now, The Winds of Winter takes place right after the events of A Dance with Dragons. And, oh, hang on. Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Oh, I see. Okay. Mm-hmm. Right. Okay. 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 I've been told that The Winds of Winter has not been written yet, so we're going to move on to the second book. Now, the second book is called Spinning Silver by Naomi Novik. Now, this has been on my list for probably about 3 years, I want to say. I read it last year at the suggestion of Patrick Leo. It's a bit of a retelling of a classic fable, but it's done in such a modern way. But you really do feel the winter-esque vibe of what's going on in this book. There's about, I want to say, 3 central POVs, so it's not too expansive. It's a relatively short book, and it takes place both in kind of a modern setting and also in a winter fae realm, which is exactly what our theme is here today. I found the POV characters to be really compelling. I found the plot line of the story to be interesting. I blasted through the book pretty quickly. So my first suggestion for you today is going to be Spinning Silver by Naomi Novik. Is a really well put together book and absolutely gives you winter vibes. I hope it works for you the same way that it worked for me. The next book on my list, I just read a couple of weeks ago, and it's called The Wickwire Watch by Jacqueline Hagan. This is book 1 in the River Falls Chronicle. It's a new series. It's kind of got a Victorian vibe to it. The season that it seems like it fits best in, even though it's not necessarily set in winter, it's got a winter vibe to it. The Wickwire Watch follows a young child who's being attacked and hounded by spirits, and he's not exactly sure why. The people, and the only people that can protect him from these creatures, are on the run and they're wanted themselves. It's a really unique story. I've not read anything like it. I think it would be a perfect winter read. So The Wickwire Watch by Jacqueline Hagan is my second pick for you for this winter. Moving on to our third book is one of my favorite authors. Now, he's taken a ton of classic myths and he's built them into a collection called Norse Mythology. Of course, the author is Neil Gaiman. And for this book, it was interesting because some of the myths that he talks about and shares with us, I've heard them before, but he's turned them into, as Neil Gaiman tends to do, he's turned them into his own. And I listened to this book on Audible. The cool part is he's got a spectacular narration voice. If you've not listened to Neil Gaiman before, I strongly suggest you do it. And Norse mythology is a great anthology, so to speak, of myths that you can, listen to one of them, turn it off, go about your day. You don't have to do it all in one setting. And there's clear breakpoints between each myth. So it's basically a collection of stories all in one book presented by the one and only Neil Gaiman. And to be honest with you, when I think of Neil Gaiman, I kind of think of winter anyway. I don't know why. It's a weird association, but that would be my third pick for my winter recommendations for you. Moving on to our fourth pick, it's going to be historical fiction, and this is The Winter King by Bernard Cornwell. I read this last May. It's book 1 in the Warlord Chronicles. It is really good. It is set in the times of King Arthur, but it is very different from the Arthurian legend that we've all heard about. Some of the main cast of characters are there. We've got King Arthur, we've got Lancelot, we've got Merlin, we've got Guinevere. but they're all quite a bit different than the classic tale that we've been told before. In fact, this tale itself is told by a brand new character called Durfel. And the plot device or the storytelling method is when Durfel's already an old man recanting his life's story to somebody else. And we get some really interesting themes about memory, about how stories get translated from person to the next. We've all kind of played that telephone game where I tell you something and you tell somebody else something, and by the time it gets 5 or 6 people down, the story's completely different. That's kind of the feel that we get with this whole trilogy. But The Winter King is exceptionally well written. It's beautiful prose. Bernard Cornwell is one of probably my top 3 or 4 authors when it comes to writing combat scenes. And so we get magic, but of course it involves Merlin, but in a little bit of a different way than, and I don't want to get into spoiler territory, when stories get told over and over through the generations, we see that magic might be a little bit different than we were inclined to believe at first. The Winter King by Bernard Cornwell is a great way to get into the winter. If you wanted to space the trilogy out throughout several months, you could do it. But hey, winter is in the name of the book. I strongly suggest, if you haven't read this before, and if you've never read historical fiction before, this was really my first foray into it. I found it to be tremendous. It's a 5-star book for me. Go take a look at it. The next book on my list today has been discussed on YouTube quite a bit. It is a series that is very highly regarded for those of us who've read it. I think the most common question that we run into is, why haven't more people read it in the first place? This is, of course, The Forgetting Moon by the one and only Brian Lee Durfee. It is a chonker of a book, but there's no pages wasted here. It's probably one of my favorite trilogies I've ever read. I haven't sat back to think about doing like a top 10 trilogies list, but I have to tell you, it's going to be right up there or very close to it. For some reason, The Forgetting Moon also gives me winter-esque vibes. There's lots of different POVs. One of the neat things that I love that Brian Lee Durfee does here is that he subverts expectations in a way that, and again, I've probably read coming up on about 1,000 fantasy books. And after you've read that much, you tend to see patterns and you kind of think you can predict things pretty early on, and you read to see if you're right, and you read to get engrossed in the story, but you're not surprised all that much by the time you get to the end if you've read enough. Not in the case of The Forgetting Moon, not in the case of this 5 Warrior Angel series in totality. He subverts expectations left and right. My best advice is, don't think you know what's going on, because the minute that you do, you're going to find out that you don't, and it'll all kind of make sense to you. But this is a brilliant book, and it's a brilliant series, and I can't think of a better time to start the 5 Warrior Angel series than in the winter with The Forgetting Moon. The next book on my winter reads list is a book that I think a lot of people are intimidated by, and the series a lot of people are intimidated by. But I am here to tell you there's absolutely no reason for you to be intimidated by the Book of the New Sun. The first book is called The Shadow of the Torturer. It's not a very long book. It's about 225-ish pages, and it's kind of got a dreamy quality to it. It takes place in the very, very, very far distant future of our planet. At least we think it's our planet. We're led to believe it's our planet. But it involves the journey of a young boy named Severian who grows up as a torturer in a torturer's guild, and he sets forth throughout the world to find his place in it. A lot of people will say that Gene Wolfe's writing is too complicated, or you're going to have questions. A typical comment about this series is the unreliable narrator or the unreliable narration of Severian himself, because like one of the other books I mentioned earlier, he's older, recanting his life's tale to us, the reader. Don't be intimidated by the Book of the New Sun. There's probably going to be some words in there that you don't know. If you get it on Kindle, it's super simple. All you do is you press the word that you don't know. The dictionary pops up. Guess what? You just learned a new word. It's educational at the same time, but it is a really complicated story, and it's really neat. And challenge yourself, if you feel like it this winter, to dive into the Book of the New Sun. You don't have to do the whole thing at once. As a matter of fact, at the end of each book, and there's 4 of them, Severian, our main character, says, hey, If this is all the further you want to go along with my journey, you can stop now. And a lot of people probably choose to do that. I went through it probably 2 books right away. I took a few months off, and then I did the books 3 and the book 4. I really recommend you check out Shadow of the Torturer. If nothing else, give it about 50 pages. I really do think for those of you that have been, like I said, quote unquote, intimidated to read Gene Wolfe or to read the Book of the New Sun, don't be. A lot of the material you're already reading is just as complicated. It's just told in a way where we're not really getting answers as fast as maybe we would like them. So it gives us a lot of more time to ruminate on some of the questions that we have. But the cool part about Gene Wolfe is he'll answer questions that you have, and he'll do it in the most nonchalant way in the middle of a random paragraph, and you'll be reading it, and you're okay, I didn't know that. Okay, that makes sense. So it's not like this great big reveal. They're these casual mentions of something that you've been wondering about for 100 pages. It's a really neat plot device. I think you're going to actually improve your intelligence if you read this book. I know that's a really odd statement to say, but I came away from Book of the New Sun feeling a little bit smarter than I did before I read it. So again, let's not be intimidated. We can jump into it. If you don't like it, you don't have to finish it, but you won't know until you try. The last book on my winter recommendations list today is one that I have not heard very much about on YouTube at all or on Booktube. The book came out, I want to say, in 2015. The author's name is Scott Hawkins, and the name of the book is The Library at Mount Char. This is a really strange book. I thought it was fantasy. I was sold to it as being a fantasy, and it is, but it also has a tremendous amount of horror elements. And it feels like a winter horror read to me the more I sit back and think about it. I did kind of an immersion reading on this where I did both Audible and eye reading at the same time to really get into the mindset of what this story was all about, because I hadn't read anything like it before. It's totally unique. In fact, I went back, and I'll tell you a little bit about sort of the plot line. We follow Carolyn, who's the main character of the book, and she's a librarian, but not so much in the way that you and I think about librarians. There's this mystical library, and there's several people who are designated librarians to watch over and master a certain section of the library. Each section of the library involves a different set of magical powers and different kinds of things that they have control of the earth. They're led by a mysterious figure named Father, and we're led to believe at the beginning of the book that Father has gone missing. It's a really interesting story, and again, I've really not heard too much about it on Booktube at all. In fact, the author, Scott Hawkins, hasn't released another book since. I went on Goodreads, I tried to find what else he's written, and it's a bunch of computer programming books. So the guy's pretty smart, but it's just really different, and it's really interesting, and it does give me a winter vibe. Having said what I just said, I tend to not read a lot of horror. So if this was a book presented to me as a horror book to begin with, I may not have read it. However, kind of like Swan Song in a way, which is one of my all-time favorite books, there's enough elements in it that brings out the horror without it being kind of a gruesome, gory horror. There's some of that in there as well, but it's more of a suspenseful type of a thing. It left me kind of hanging from chapter to chapter, and I wanted to bring it up today because very few people seem to have talked about the Library of Mount Char, and if you're the Library at Mount Char, and if you're looking for something different here, I think that would be an excellent choice for a winter read. Okay, so those are 7 recommendations of books that I think you might have some fun with this winter. As usual, we have to do one for the road. And our theme today on One for the Road is patience. I don't want to get very preachy. I know myself, I am very impatient at times. And I think sometimes I do these one for the roads to remind myself. But patience is really important. If not for other people, then for yourself. We can get impatient standing online somewhere. We can get impatient have you ever had one of those days where you hit every red light possible and you think like the world is against you and you're just impatient for the light to turn green? What I try to do in these situations, and what I encourage you to do, is take a deep breath and think about something that is very calming to you. Realize that whatever is causing your impatience is bound to fade away relatively quickly, and try not to let yourself get so worked up about something that's not all that important in any scheme of things. It's not important in the little scheme, it's not important in the middle scheme, and it's not important for sure in the big scheme of things. So let's all work on patience today. I wish you happy winter reading. I will see you in the next episode of BellTube, and here's your fortune.